ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात् ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Namaste, my dear friends. This is video number 4 on Ramana Gita. This video starts with chapter number 6, Mind Control. Commentary. Note that verses in this chapter are spontaneous statements made by the Maharishi and not replies to questions. One has to look for the cause of restlessness of the mind. Any action done with the sense of doership leaves a residual memory after the action is over. Experiences of past actions are stored in the mind and give it a directional pull. When similar situations arise, this pull from the seeds of past action, called vasanas or latent tendencies, would externalize the mind. Contact with the sense objects in the present can be expected to produce the mental reactions of going along with or resisting a particular action, depending on the pleasantness or unhappiness of the past experience. If the storehouse of such tendencies is left uncontrolled, the mind becomes a prisoner of the past and is unable to be steady or steadfast in meditation. If mind control is desired, the question would naturally arise as to how these tendencies can be eradicated or reduced. The ultimate solution is only through finding one's own true nature, for that alone can burn away the vast mass of tendencies. Till then, along with the way the Maharishi suggests aids, these aids are spelled out in the subsequent verses. Verse 3, one should control the fecal mind by restraint of breath. Then it would, like a tethered animal, cease to stray. Commentary. If the mind is strong, not distracted, then self-enquiry can take place without aids. A weak mind, dissipated mind, however, needs a probe in order to stick to a single thought stream. Breath regulation would serve this purpose best. In this Upadesharam, Ramana gives another analogy, that of a bird being caught in a net. Then perforce the mind's freedom would be curtailed. Ramana says the mind is the rider and breath is the horse. Pranayama, breath regulation, is a check on the horse. By that the rider is checked. Just a little may be done. It serves as a brake, serves a car. As a brake serves a car. Conscious Immortality, Paul Brunton, page 15. Translation by Krishna Bhikshu. 5. Control of breath means merely watching with the mind the flow of breath. Through such constant watching, kumbhaka retention does come about. 6. For those unable to achieve kumbhaka this way, the method of Hatha Yoga Pranayama is prescribed. 7. That is Rechaka. Exhalation should be done for 1 unit of time. Purka, inhalation for 1 unit. Kumbhaka, retention for 4 units. Thus, the channels of the life force are purified. A.R. Natarajan translation. 33. Verse 5. Watching the flow of breath with the mind is restraint of it. Such watching, if constant, steadies the breath. Commentary. Since breath regulation is an important aid for mind control, the question arises what constitutes such control? Ramana provides an original solution which is different from the yogic practices set out in the next verse. For what matters is the mind, and the use of it for stabilizing breath is a new path, as effective as yogic practices, needing expert guidance which may or may not be available. The condition precedent for the effectiveness of the method is that the watching should be constant. Verse 6. If the mind lacks the necessary strength for constant watching of breath, then restriction of breath by Hatha yogic practices is suggested. Verse 7. Exhaling 1 unit of time, inhaling 1 unit of time, and retaining breath for 4 units purifies the channels through which breath flows. Commentary. Verse 7 sets out what is meant by Hatha yogic practice. Ramana recommends it as the second best method for breath regulation. Watching the breath is preferred if one is able to do so because then the subsidence of breath comes about naturally, whereas Hatha yogic practices bring it about by force. Ramana recommends different alternatives because of different natural temperaments. Also, somehow one should get back by any appropriate method best suited to the practitioner, to the source, to the heart. 8. When they become clean, the channels of the life force, prana gets controlled gradually. Control of every prana activity is called Sudha Kumbhaka. 9. Others, that is, Jnanis define Rechika as the abandonment of the I am the body idea. Purka as the search for the self and Sahaja Sthiti or abidance in the self as Kumbhaka. 10. Even by japa of mantras, mind gets controlled. Then the mantra becomes one with the mind as with the prana. 11. When the letters of the mantra become with the prana, it is termed dhyana, and then dhyana becomes deep and firm. It leads to sahaja sthiti. 12. By constant association with great enlightened saints, also the mind merges in its own source. Seers is the translation of Swaminathan. 34. Translation and commentary by A.R. Natarajan. Verse 8. Breath control comes about gradually when the channels are purified. When such regulation becomes permanent, it becomes natural. Verse 9. The wise regard the giving up of the notion I am the body as exhaling, self enquiry as inhaling, and abidance in the heart as natural subsidence. Commentary. The root cause of mental distractions is the ego or the self imposed limitation of identifying oneself with a particular names or form. It is this which extern, externalize the mind. Self inquiry is the most potent means for ridding oneself of this false idea and for the mind to be absorbed in the heart. Verse 10. The mind also gets controlled by repetition of sacred syllables. Then the syllables, the mind, and the breath become one. Verse 11. The merging of the mind and breath is termed dhyana, and it leads to the natural state when it becomes deep and firm. Commentary. A time honored method of mind control is the repetition of sacred words done in loud or low tones. Mental repetition is superior. Mental worship is considered superior as it requires alertness to mental movements, and the mind could be quickly brought back to the desired thought. Such mental attention leads simultaneously to even breath, and this in turn enables the journey back to the source. A stilled mind can be used to pursue a single thought till the mind merges in the heart. Once again, the emphasis is on somehow quietening the mind, enabling its interning and returning to the heart. Verse 12. By keeping daily the company of great ones always rooted in consciousness, one's mind gets merged in its source. Commentary. Scriptures say three things are rare: human birth, desire for knowing the truth, and the company of sages. Verse 12 deals with the third. In chapter 6, Ramana suggests four means: 1. Breath regulation by watching with the mind; 2. Forcible control of breath through Hatha Yoga; 3. Single minded repetition of certain sacred words; 4. The company of the great ones. Again, the point made is that somehow one must merge the mind in the source. Of course, these means are not alternatives. They can be and are often combined in spiritual practice. 35. A story. The company of those rooted in Sat or truth is referred to. Only in their presence is the mind subdued. Dakshinamurti Shiva, a classic example, transmitted wisdom to four disciples through his potent silence. Ramana used to relate a story to illustrate the value of the presence of such great ones. Once Tatvaroyar, a disciple of Svarupanand, composed a special verse in presence of his beloved master. When learned scholars heard it, they objected, saying that a verse in that meter could be written only in praise of a hero who had killed 1,000 elephants. So Tatvorayar took them to his master so that they could know for themselves. When they all reached there, the master revealed the truth by his silence. Many days and nights passed, but those who came to dispute remained sitting quietly, oblivious of the purpose for which they had come. Ultimately, the master himself willed to bring to an end the quietude by allowing a thought ripple in his mind. The atmosphere of purity and serenity surrounding such a person makes the minds of those in their presence also tranquil. If the association of the wise is obtained, to what purpose are the various methods of self discipline? Tell me, of what use is the fan when the cool, gentle south wind is blowing? Supplement to 40 verses, verse 3. Krishna Bhiksu translation 1. The seventh canto narrates the splendid dialogue between Karshni of Bhardwaja family and Acharya Ramana. 2. Karshni asked what is the nature of self-enquiry, which is the result hoped for by its pursuit. Is a greater good obtainable following any other path? Bhagwan said, the I thought is said to be the totality of all thoughts. The source of that I thought must be searched for, investigated. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 1. This seventh chapter records the excellent conversation between Karshni of Bhardwaja line and Acharya Ramana. Verse 2. What constitutes self-enquiry? What is its utility? Can better results be achieved through other methods? Commentary. Devarta had been advised by Ramana to pursue non-objective inquiry, an inquiry centered on the subject, the individual, steadfastly and single-mindedly. The tools used for achieving this are explained in later verses. The questioner in verse 2 wishes to know the relative merits of this path and that of others like breath control, incantations, repetition of sacred words, and the like. Even a fool would not wish to act without seeking benefit. Hence, the need to know about the value of this method, self enquiry. End of chapter 6, Mind Control. Chapter 7, Self Enquiry, Competence and Components. Ramana Gita, chapter 3, verse 5, verse 3. The I thought is said to be the sum total of all thoughts. Enquire into the source of this I thought. Commentary. In Science of the Heart, chapter 5, Ramana has already indicated on the basis of his own experience that the I thought is the core or essence of the mind and that it springs from the heart. The enquiry, whence am I, has been repeatedly stressed by Ramana in all his teachings. Wherefrom does this I thought arise? If one enquires thus, it vanishes. On the rising of the ego, everything rises. With its subsidence, all subsides. The ego is therefore all. Tracking it is the way to victory over everything. Updeshasram, verse 19, Sat Darshanam, verse 25. The first essential for the search is the attitude of enquiry, an attitude of doubt about our identity and the strong urge to find it. Next, of course, is to gather together the distracted, scattered mind at the core by fixing attention on the root I thought. The mind should be turned inwards and kept active in the quest without taking in external impressions or thinking of other things. Vigilance is needed not only to ward off distracting thoughts but also to proceed deeper within, but not be taken in by mental quietness. The one for whom the silence exists has to be inquired into. Paradoxical as it may seem, there is no escape from effort till the I thought the mind is sucked into the heart. If properly directed, the joy of the journey itself will sustain the effort. The onward process of effort and tasting bliss of the self and slackening of effort and slipping back to the thought world goes on till self abidance is continuous, till the I thought stays merged in its source. The heart self inquiry is the straight path because in this method the final question is the one that is raised from the beginning. The nature of mind is inquired into straight away. Ramana explained to Paul Brunter the advantage of self inquiry. Mental quiet is easier to attain and earlier, but the goal is mental destruction. Most paths lead to the first, whereas the self inquiry leads to it quickly and then to the second. In other words, other means may also lead to the subsidence of the mind, but it would rise again, for they imply the retention of the mind as the instrument of practice which would lead to its perpetuation. The ego may take different and subtler forms at different stages of one's practice, but it is itself never destroyed. Another basic advantage of self inquiry is that it can be practiced wherever one is and in whatever situation. It does not depend on outer circumstances, the shaping of which may be beyond one's control. Conscious Immortality, Paul Bruntel, Maharishi's Gospel, page 51. All spiritual effort is to get back to the heart. For this, attention to the I thought is an effective means because it is the only clue we have about ourselves. It is like a dog tracking the master from whom it has parted by unerringly holding onto his scent. I is the sense of existence in the ego, the reality which is mixed up with the erroneous idea of identification as this. If one holds on to the I to the exclusion of everything else, then it would lead one back. 37. To the heart, for it is an infallible clue. Tracking the I thought to its source is a spiritual treasure hunt. And in this, what is required is to isolate the ego from its associates, other thoughts, to question its false quietude, and to push beyond where effort is no longer possible. The seeker, the individual, would be drawn within into the source, and only a vast beatitude would endure. The Ramana way in search of self, Kumari Sarda, Krishna Bhiksu translation. This investigation, verse 3, is self inquiry and not poring over scriptural text. When the source is searched for, the I notion merges into that source. 5. The I thought is only a semblance reflection of the self. When that thought dissolves, there remains the undiluted primary self, the reality, perfect and full all around. 6. The result that flows from self inquiry is the end of all miseries and difficulties. This is the last word on rewards, Phala. There is no greater reward than this. A.R. Natarajan translation, verse 4. This is self inquiry and not the critical study of scriptures. When the source is searched, the ego gets merged in it. Commentary. Critical study of scriptures provides intellectual comprehension of truth but does not by itself provide the direct experience. The inquiry pertaining to the self, the subject, the I results in conscious merging of it in the heart, therefore provides direct experience of the fullness of existence. The search for the source is emphasized because when the habitual anchorage of the I thought with other thoughts is cut off, thus isolating the I thought for in inspection, its es- escape route, the dissipating thoughts are cut off, then it must necessarily fall back on the self, its succor. When through effort mind is gathered, all its root and lull is transcended, the I comes within the magnetic zone of the heart in which it will perforce merge. Liberating question, Kumari Sarda, page 24. Verse 5. The self alone remains in all its perfection and fullness when the ego, which is its reflection, merges in it. Commentary. Questions would arise: what happens when the mind merges in its source? Would one cease to exist? Would there be a void? Would actions be possible? These doubts arise because one's whole world is centered on the mind or feeling of separate existence. It is precisely these fears that are allayed by this verse. All that would happen would be a shift. Instead of a mind based life, a heart based life would take over. Its nature would be integral, whole, and perfect. Therefore, one would be aware of the feeling of fullness as I. When the I thought perishes, then another I springs forth as the heart spontaneously. It is existence in all its fullness. The question would then arise: are there two eyes? Not so. Ramana has already explained that the mind is only the reflection of the heart. So long as one is not aware of his fact and the mind is regarded as separate, it would not be possible to be aware of the throb of the heart as the fullness of oneself. When the mind is absorbed in the heart, the incessant flash of I of consciousness is felt. When the sun rises, all activities of the world are carried on. Similarly, when consciousness, which is unlimited and complete, alone remains, actions will be performed automatically and perfectly. Verse 6. The result of self inquiry is the cure for all sorrows. It is the highest of all results. There is nothing greater than this. Commentary. Paraphrase. Self inquiry opens up awareness of the inherent bliss which we are by cutting at the root of the primal ignorance of one's true nature arising out of identification of oneself with the body. The primal ignorance being the cause for all sorrows, there is no greater action or result. Krishna Bhiksu translation 7. Wonderful mystic powers may be had through other means, even when they are obtained. Bliss can be had only through self inquiry. 8. Krishna asked, who is said to be fit to go on with this inquiry? Can one know by himself his own fitness? Bhagwan replied, one whose mind is pure through upasana, spiritual practice, or other means, or by the merit of his deeds in past lives, whose mind perceives evils, imperfections alone in the body and sensory objects. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 7. Marvelous occult powers are possible through practices other than self inquiry, but even if one secures such powers, ultimately self inquiry alone gives liberation. Commentary. A common human hankering is for powers, siddhis, such powers dazzle, dazzle the unwary. They lead one away from the single minded search for self knowledge. Ramana always cautions against their lures. They help no one to know the self. Ramana advises Humphreys that clairvoyance are not worth having when for greater illumination and peace is possible without them than with them. Ramana also points out that such powers are no better than dreams. They come and go. They involve exercise of the mind and are within its framework. Liberation implies freedom from thought movements following erasure of latent tendencies. True power can only be firm abidance in the self, in the heart, for then one can control, relapse into the illusion that one is the body. Verse 8. Who is considered fit for self inquiry? Can one know his own fitness? Verse 9. He whose mind has been purified by spiritual practices or by accumulated merit of past lives and who has distaste for the body and the sense objects is fit for such inquiry. Commentary to follow verse 9, 10, and 11 taken together. Krishna Bhiksu translation 8. Krishna asked, who is said to be fit to go on with this inquiry. Can one know by himself his own fitness? Bhagwan replied, 10. One whose mind feels utter distaste whenever it has to function amongst sense objects, and whose mind realizes that the body is transitory, he is said to be the fit one for self enquiry. 11. By two signs, that is, one realization that the body is transitory and perishable, and two, the distaste felt towards sense objects, one's own fitness of for self-inquiry can be recognized. 12 and 13. Kersey asked, when one is fit for self-inquiry by his distaste for self-objects or by discrimination, will baths or sandhya, adoration of the sun at dawn, noon and dusk, japa oblations poured into the fire, chant of Vedas, worship of gods, bhajans, pilgrimages, sacrifice, giving in charity and observance of special spiritual practices aid his purpose, or are they just to while away time? Bhagwan replied, if the competent ones starts on the self-inquiry with shrinking attachments, all these works will make the mind increasingly pure. A.R. Natarajan translation, verse 8. Who is considered fit for self-inquiry? Can one know his own fitness? Answer, verse 9, 10, 11, verse 9. He whose mind has been purified by spiritual practices or by accumulated merit of past lives, and who has distaste for the body and the sense objects, is fit for such inquiry. Verse 10. The one who feels utter distaste when his mind has to move among sense objects, and who is conscious of the transitoriness of the body, is said to be a competent one for self enquiry. Verse 11. By the marks of a sense of transitoriness of the body and by detachment to sense objects, one's fitness for self enquiry can be known. Commentary. Is self enquiry possible only for the spiritually mature? The scriptures prescribe several spiritual practices for the purification of the mind, including discrimination between real and unreal, permanent, impermanent, discussed in chapter 1. Ramana's replies are always positive, the truth being explained in the light of the natural inclinations of the questioner. Perhaps this is why Ramana replies that Vairagya, non-attachment to sense objects and distaste for transitory things, is a mark of those suited for self-inquiry. It would be useful to remember that Ramana's emphasis is not on the qualities of the mind, not on its content, but about its nature and about its source. It could be said that all those who are prepared to keep the gunpowder of the spirit dry, who are earnest to find out the truth, all those brave enough to be prepared to lose life in order to find it, are fit for self enquiry. Verse 12 and 13. For the one who is ripe for self inquiry by his discrimination and non attachment are baths, prayers at as stated times, meditation, maintaining the sacred fire, worship of God, devotional singing, pilgrimage, sacrifice, charity, austerity is useful, or are they a mere waste of time? Verse 14. For competent beginners with waning attachments, all these actions make the mind increasingly pure. Commentary. Essentially, the question is whether the supplementing of self inquiry by other spiritual practices would be necessary or not. Ramana's reply in verse 14 covers the early stages of the practice of self inquiry when enough faith in its exclusive practice might not have developed and skill in practice not yet achieved. Besides, one may be reluctant to give up fully or partly the practices one is habituated to. At this stage, the other practices would help in purifying and strengthening the mind for pursuing self inquiry more effectively. Krishna Bhiksu Translation 15. Meritorious actions of the mind, the speech, and the body destroy other contrary actions of the mind, the speech, or the body. 16. All these actions of the ripe, competent persons of extremely pure minds result in the good of the world. 17. The wise act of to serve as models for others and for their well-being and not through fear of the compelling scripture. A.R. Natarajan Translation. Verse 15. Virtuous activity of the body, speech, and mind destroys the opposite activity of body, speech, and mind. Commentary. Activity is inevitable for those not firmly established in the truth in the heart. Such activity can be only one of three types using the body, speech, or mind. The activities set out by Karshani in verse 12 are virtuous activities engaging in which prevents the contrary activity of mind leading to further involvement in sense attractions. The value of virtuous actions lies in their purifactory effect. When the sense of doership is destroyed by self inquiry, action would be neither good nor bad, but only be for the welfare of the world. Verse 16. Activity of mature masters with absolutely pure minds benefits the world. Verse 17. The mature masters do not engage in actions out of fear of spiritual injunctions. Their actions are for welfare and teaching of others. Commentary. The meritorious actions set out in verse 12, baths, prayers at stated times, meditation, worship, etc., may be performed for fear of violating spiritual injunctions. Atonement would become necessary for failure to observe such injunctions. The wise know of no fear, be it of the spiritual authority or any other. So, fear cannot motivate them, nor can the satisfaction of desires be the cause of that activity. For the exalted yogi abiding steadily in the natural state, having destroyed the mind, is there any action left? Asks Ramana. Again he queries, who can understand the exalted state of the one who has dissolved the ego and disallow abiding in the self? In There is no reason for such persons to be performing actions. The question arises as to why they are active. It is to teach the world by example, to be a guidepost for those treading a path to self, and no one can come near him without being blessed. Ramana was asked why he did not go about preaching the truth, and his reply was, "How do you know I am not doing it? Which is better, to preach loudly without effect, or to sit silently sending out inner force?" Satya Darshanam, verse 31. Maharishi's Gospel, page 15, 16. Krishna Bhiksu translation. 18. Meritorious actions of one who has destroyed the sense of difference between the self and the world, and that are carried out with non attachment, do not stand in the way of self enquiry. 19. When a ripe one, mature jiva in the pursuit of self enquiry does not act as prescribed, sin does not accrue. Self inquiry is of the greatest merit and is the holy of holies. 20. Activity of the ripe souls fit for inquiry is twofold. They give up activity only for practicing yoga, meditation, or upasana in solitude. They favor action only for the sake of others. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 18. Meritorious actions done without attachment and without a sense of difference do not obstruct self inquiry. Commentary. Action, if ethically right and done with detachment towards the fruits, will not hinder self inquiry. By implication, the opposite type of action, namely action for fulfilling desire, would deflect the mind from self inquiry. Verse 19. Failure to perform prescribed action is not sinful for the wise, for self inquiry itself is the most meritorious and the most purifying. Commentary. Whether the wise act or remain inactive, they can incur no sin. The one for whom merit and demerit exist is destroyed in the fire of knowledge. Incessant self inquiry, which enables unswerving abidance in the heart, emerges one in consciousness, total and free from any blemish. Verse 20. The wise appear to fall into two categories: those who renounce action for solitary communion, and those engaged in action for the welfare of others. Commentary. There is an apparent difference in the ways of life of the wise. Some are lost in nirvikalpa samadhi with no object awareness, and others are active, working for the good of the world. The activity of the latter does not disturb their rootedness in the heart. They abide in the natural state. Since their ego is dead, their action does not bind them. Krishna Bhiksu translation 21. Karsini asked if there is another way to obtain the final liberation. Is it one or varied? May Bhagwan be pleased to tell me. 22. Bhagwan replied, one strives to attain the jiva, the other self seeks the one who strives to attain. The first goes the long way, but at the end attains the self. 23. The mind of one meditating on one object only takes one from one form only. One pointedness, a single form of the thought. One pointedness leads on to abidance in the self. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 21. Bhagwan, please tell if there are paths to liberation other than self inquiry. Are these paths one or different? Verse 22. Other paths strive to attain something. Self inquiry seeks the one who makes the effort. The first one takes longer, but in the end, the self is known. Self inquiry taught by Ramana is a straight path. Attention is focused from the very beginning on the mind, its nature and source. The other methods, worship of God, action performed without desire for results, breath control, meditation on identity with self, all these gradually purify the mind. The thought wheel which separates one from the natural state is not consciously tackled until self-inquiry is practiced. Hence, other paths are necessarily longer. Verse 23. Meditation on a single thought makes the mind one-pointed, and such one-pointedness leads to self-abidance. Commentary. In Upadesasram, Ramana points out that the mind which has been gathered together through spiritual practices should be used to push inward till the goal, the self, is reached. Krishna Bhiksu Translation 24. If one meditates continuously, he may not desire that end, self abidance, but he would eventually abide in the self. The other, the enquirer, knowingly abides in the self. 25. The object of meditation, be it a deity or a mantra or any other high object on which one meditates, merges at the end into the great effulgence of the self. 26. Either through meditation or self inquiry, the same goal is attained. One subsides into that through meditation, the other through knowledge. A.R. Natarajan translation, verse 24. The one who meditates attains the self without being aware of it, himself in the self. Commentary. In the path of self inquiry, the mind has to be ever vigilant and cannot be allowed to lapse into inattention. By effort, distracting thoughts are warded off and one holds on to the core thought. When the mind is turned inward by inquiry, it is kept active. The merging of the mind in the self comes from conscious effort. It is a conscious immortality. Dualistic paths too would take one to the same goal ultimately. What then is the difference? Even during practice in the direct path, self enquiry, there would be the experiencing of the bliss of the self. In the paths, the enquirer consciously loses, retaining the ego. The fullness of the experience is postponed till the end when the worshipper unconsciously merges in the worshipped, the self. Verse 25. The excellent object of meditation, be it God or a sacred word, merges in the end in the great fire of the self. Commentary. The subject object relationship which subsists in all forms of meditations using the mind comes to an end when one attains the self. All duality ceases, the one all pervasive consciousness alone remains. Verse 26. The goal of the meditative path and self inquiry is one. The former reaches essential stillness through contemplation and the latter through knowledge. Note, Sanskrit version in Ramana's own handwriting can be seen in photo file in Ramana Gita folder. Krishna Bhiksu translation. 1. In reply to another question of Karsani himself, Bhagwan Muni enunciated what conduct was allowed in each of the four asramas. 2. Be he a bachelor or householder, an anchorite or an ascetic, a woman or a shudra, whoever is ripe and fit may investigate the Supreme. 3. This order in the asrama serves like a flight of steps in finding the Supreme. One of a very ripe mind needs not follow this order. A.R. Natarajan translation. Verse 1, in reply to another question by Karshani, Bhagwan explained the duties of the four stages of life. Verse 2, a bachelor, a householder, a forest dweller, a sannyasi, a woman, or a person outside caste may inquire into Brahma if rife. Commentary. The important the important point made by Ramana in this chapter is that self-inquiry and self-knowledge are common property and that stages in life, sex and the like have no relevance for it. The scriptures divide life into four stages as above and prohibit study of the Vedas by women and persons not belonging to the three castes. The doubt would rise whether the stages in life have any relevance for pursuit of self-inquiry and whether engaging in spiritual practices for enlightenment is open to women and to those not belonging to any of the. End of chapter 7, self-inquiry, competence and components. Thank I complete this video. Next video will start with chapter number 8 on ashramas. Thank you for watching this video. Namaskar my dear friend. Thank you.